Hi everybody and welcome to the latest in our series of videos on Unit 2S, the making of modern Britain. In our previous video we began to look at the Wilson government, the Labour government of 1964 through to 1970. This video looks at one particular aspect of that government, in particular looking at the liberalising reforms on a number of issues such as abortion and divorce, and also we have a look at educational reform, thinking both about the school system and also about higher education. First of all then, social change and liberal reforms. The key person who you need to be aware of here is Wilson's Home Secretary. Roy Jenkins is appointed as Home Secretary in December 1965, and Jenkins, although he is at the time a member of the Labour cabinet, is very much a liberal with a small L. In other words, he believes in personal freedom. The social change of the 50s was something that Jenkins was very much in favour of, and he knew very well that social change really had come during the 50s, and he, like you of course, would know that, for example, questions had been raised about the establishment, particularly after the Suez crisis and the Profumo affair. He would have been very aware of the technological developments and the ways in which both they and affluence were beginning to change the role of women, for example. And of course Jenkins would have been very aware too of changes in youth culture. We've talked before about the teddy boys, about the mods and rockers, for example. What Jenkins believed, though, was that it was now time for Parliament and the law to step in. If that momentum for social change that had built up in the 50s was going to be continued, then politicians had to step up and actually change the law so that further change could continue in society. And there were a number of issues, abortion, divorce, capital punishment and homosexuality, where Jenkins either initiated legislation as Home Secretary or he enabled it. Sometimes it came from individual MPs, as we will see in a minute. But in all of those cases, this was groundbreaking stuff. This led to really significant social change, something that Jenkins was passionate about. Not surprisingly, given the issues that we're considering, all of these issues were controversial. There were very strong feelings on both sides, and there was real opposition to Jenkins and his approach from parts of the media, from some members of the public, and also, of course, some members of the Parliament, not least one or two members of the Labour cabinet itself. And again, that's something we'll move on to look at. You need to be aware of some of the parliamentary processes which enabled and allowed some of this liberal legislation to be passed. Quite interesting when we look at Wilson's cabinet itself. Wilson's priority when he became Prime Minister, as we've discussed before, was very much about the economy. It was about technological change. Now we know, of course, he was thwarted in some of that, but nevertheless that had been his priority, particularly an emphasis on economic stability, on long-term planning. This idea of really quite rapid social change being directed from on high was not something that Wilson was entirely comfortable with. In particular, there were members of the cabinet like Jim Callaghan from a more working class background, like George Brown, and some Labour MPs who really felt that this liberal legislation was either something Labour shouldn't be prioritising, or in some cases, these were issues where they themselves took a conservative stance. That's conservative with a small c, a more traditional stance. So this wasn't necessarily something that Wilson imagined his government would be pushing. However, on a lot of these issues, and this was the case both before and after this period too, when Parliament debated them, they were put to what we call a free vote. Now, you may know that on most issues in Parliament, members of a particular party are told by the party leader and by the party whip what they should be voting for. On most issues, for example, around the economy, Wilson as Prime Minister would have made it very clear this is the way, as a Labour MP, you will vote. Now, a free vote is different. It's where Conservative MPs, Labour MPs, Liberal MPs were allowed to vote entirely according to their conscience, because, of course, these are really quite significant moral issues of conscience, particularly something like abortion, for example. And it was these free votes which meant that even though some Labour MPs voted against, you'll sometimes find some Conservative MPs vote in favour of the more liberal line, and these bills are ultimately passed. Now, we said that Jenkins pushed some of these through Parliament, but on some of these issues, like abortion, like homosexuality, they begin as private members' bills. Now, a bill, as you may be aware, is what we call a law in its draft stage. While it's being debated by Parliament, hasn't yet been passed, it's known as a bill. Once the law has been passed by Parliament, we call it an act. So a private member's bill is in draft form, and by private members we're talking about ordinary MPs, MPs who don't sit on the front bench, they're not members of the cabinet or the shadow cabinet. These are ordinary, what we call backbench MPs. And a lot of these bits of legislation, as we'll see, begin as these private members' bills. Now, generally speaking in Parliament, it's quite difficult for a private member's bill to succeed because one MP ultimately doesn't have the political strength that a government or a prime minister has. But what's different here is that Jenkins, as a leading politician, as Home Secretary, is very sympathetic on all of these issues. He makes sure that there's enough time for the House of Commons and the House of Lords to discuss these issues. He does everything he can to make sure that even if it's a private member's bill, it will get through. And what we'll see as we look at the main issues is just how successful these individual MPs were, partly thanks to their own campaigning, but partly thanks as well to the encouragement and support of Roy Jenkins. So let's look at the first issue. The first issue is capital punishment or the death penalty. This was something that was still handed out for some cases of murder in Britain, even as we moved into 1964. It was an issue where public opinion was increasingly divided. There'd generally been a majority in favour of capital punishment, but the number of people supporting abolition was growing, particularly because of the Ruth Ellis case. Ruth Ellis was the last woman to be hanged in Britain, and although it was pretty clear that she was guilty, she was a young mother, she had been in a string of abusive relationships. The idea that a woman in this position should be executed was hugely controversial, and for some people was simply wrong. It was immoral. And so the people wanting abolition of the death penalty pointed to the Ruth Ellis case to say the death penalty is simply wrong. Now, there'd been some progress. The Conservative government under Macmillan had reduced the number of offences for which the death penalty would be given in 1957, but they didn't abolish it entirely. Now, this is a case where it's a private member's bill. It's a Labour MP called Sidney Silverman who campaigns tirelessly for years, and his proposal to Parliament is we ought to abolish capital punishment for a trial period of 5 years, and Parliament agrees to this in 1965. This is a good example not only of a private member's bill, but of a free vote of MPs as well. So this is a trial period of 5 years, but actually 4 years into that, in 1969, Parliament votes to abolish hanging completely. Now, there's a technicality there. It's not till the late 1990s and the Human Rights Act that the death penalty for treason is officially abolished, but there was no way that would be carried out in practice after this date. To all intents and purposes, capital punishment has gone in 1969. Very much with Jenkins' support. Jenkins believed that the death penalty had no place in a civilised society. Wasn't just capital punishment either for Jenkins. Corporal punishment had been used in prisons, for example, where prisoners had rioted or defied instructions, where it was felt that they ought to be punished within prison. They could be beaten. And Jenkins again says this is completely out of place and completely wrong, and he made sure that was ended in 1967. One other thing that Jenkins did was, up until his period as Home Secretary, in order to convict people in a crime, you had to have a unanimous verdict. All 12 members of the jury had to agree. Jenkins changed that. He brought in majority verdicts, the system that we still know today. And in most cases, from then on, it was a 10-2 majority, or of course an 11-1 majority that was enough to convict. And what that helped, particularly when it came to organised crime, was that a lot of dangerous criminals who might not have been convicted in the past were now sentenced to prison. In terms of the abolition of capital punishment, one thing that abolitionists had argued was that it will make society more civilised, and despite what you might imagine, it will bring down the murder rate. Now, a few years on, the murder rate hadn't particularly changed. Now, the abolitionists said, regardless of that, there is a moral case for abolishing the death penalty, but the supporters of hanging argued that by removing the option of the death penalty, ultimately, what was the deterrent now going to be for criminals? So this was massively significant, but also, like all these issues, pretty controversial too. Let's move on to the next issue, which is the issue of divorce. Again, with all of these issues, it's hard to imagine in some ways the Britain of the 50s and 60s, but it is the case that until the 1960s, if you wanted to file for divorce, either the husband or wife had to prove that the other person had committed adultery, that they'd had an affair. Now, if you were rich and you could afford a camera or a private detective, maybe you could do that. If you weren't rich, this was almost impossible. And Jenkins said, this is hugely outdated. He said, there are plenty of cases where marriages have broken down, plenty of cases where both parties are unhappy, there's not been any adultery, but nevertheless, why should that couple have to stay together? And Jenkins pushes the Divorce Reform Act through Parliament in 1969. And from then on, we get a system which is more like the system that we're familiar with. Now, the idea of a no-fault divorce comes in. So where a marriage has broken down, can't be retrieved, it's ended, then a couple, whether or not there's been adultery, could now get a divorce. The technicalities are there. So if they've been separated for 2 years and both want a divorce, after that 2-year period, they can get one. If only one of the husband or wife wants a divorce, even then, as long as they've been separated for 5 years, a divorce could be granted. So this again is really quite a significant change, but once again, it's controversial. Some members of Parliament, particularly some Conservative MPs, absolutely against it, but ultimately the majority vote in favour of the Divorce Reform Act. And the impact of this is not very surprising. Clearly, the divorce rate increases quite rapidly, and you can see it's by about 500%, going from 2 divorces per 1,000 married couples in the 50s through to around 10 per 1,000 20 years later. So not a very surprising impact. Clearly, people did take advantage of the fact that it was now somewhat easier to get divorced. Now, some people have argued that this was not just the result of the Divorce Reform Act. By the time you get to the late 60s and the 70s, the feminist movement is in the ascendancy, and women were increasingly likely not to stay in unhappy marriages or even abusive marriages. And so the rise of feminism, greater female independence undoubtedly contributed too. But it's certainly the case that by making divorce easier, by making divorce more possible, the Act clearly is going to lead to an increase, and quite a significant increase, in the figures as well. Once again, a really very significant piece of legislation. Moving on to the next issue, possibly even more controversial, the issue of abortion. Now, abortion was illegal until 1967. What that absolutely didn't mean is that abortion didn't happen, and what we see is up until 1967, there's anything up to about 200,000 illegal abortions per year. So abortion is illegal apart from some very tight medical grounds, but clearly there's a lot of abortions happening. Again, if you're rich, you can afford a private clinic, which is likely to be somewhat more hygienic. If you are not very wealthy, you would go to a backstreet abortionist where hygiene was often very poor, where there was clearly no regulation because it was illegal. And the statistics are pretty horrifying, aren't they? Around about 35,000 women a year went to hospital because of backstreet abortions, and 82 women die in that 3-year period, as you can see there as well. And so the Abortion Law Reform Association, which had been around since World War II, argued, look, abortions are happening in any case, far better to make them legal, to make them regulated, to make them hygienic, and to make sure that women don't die as a result of them. They said that's far better than the situation we're in at the moment. And as we move through the 60s, there's something called the thalidomide disaster. Thalidomide was a drug that pregnant women had been recommended to take to deal with morning sickness. It had led to all sorts of congenital deformities in babies, quite a lot of babies born without their long arm or leg bones. And a lot of the public said that in those cases, women should have had the right to choose to have a termination. And so the thalidomide disaster actually strengthens the case for a lot of the pro-abortion campaigners. On the other hand, clearly there is huge opposition to changing the law as well. An organisation called SPUC, the Society for Protection of Unborn Children, is set up in 1966, and their argument is if we legalise abortion at all, we'll end up very quickly with it being a slippery slope and we'll have abortion on demand. Women will be able to get abortions far too easily for minimal reasons. So the arguments are powerful and passionate on both sides. In terms of Parliament, this time it's a private member's bill again. This time it's David Steele, a very well-known Liberal MP, becomes Liberal leader in a later era, but he's the one who introduces the private member's bill. Just like Sidney Silverman on capital punishment, Steele has the support of Jenkins, and that is crucial. And once again, Parliament votes in a Liberal direction, and in 1967, the Abortion Act is passed. You can see the details there. Abortion is now legal up to 28 weeks. There will be medical supervision, and there must be medical supervision, and 2 doctors must give their written permission. Crucially, a woman could have a termination, not just in the case of physical issues, but with this phrase, mental suffering as well, where a woman could show to 2 doctors that unless she had an abortion, there would be some form of mental suffering, then it would generally be signed off. And again, for some people, this was going too far. For some people, this was a long overdue piece of legislation. Once more, not surprisingly really, we are going to see an increase in the number of abortions once the Act is passed, and you can see there that the abortion rate goes up by around about 400, just over 400%, between 68 and 75. Now, interestingly, David Steele had said, actually, I don't expect this to happen, because what Steele had argued is let's accompany the Abortion Act with a real push for better contraception, better sex education, better education about contraception, and therefore it won't be the case that so many women will go and have a termination. Actually, with better sex education, with more effective contraception, we won't see a massive rise in the abortion rate. Now, the statistics by 1975 suggest that Steele was perhaps not entirely right there, perhaps too optimistic. And that's why abortion continued and continues to be a controversial issue. But once again, what a significant change in Britain in the 60s, in these Labour years. And the final issue is what would have been referred to at the time as homosexual relations. And again, it's quite hard to imagine this in our 21st century Britain, but up until the 60s, if you were a man and you were arrested for participating in a homosexual act, because that was unlawful, you could be sent to prison for up to 2 years, and those sentences were quite often enforced. Now, you may remember the Wolfenden report. This had been presented to the Conservative government in the 50s, and Wolfenden had said to the government, we should decriminalise homosexuality. The Conservatives had rejected the report, and as we've hinted already, the Wilson government itself included some more small c Conservative members. People like Callaghan were not entirely convinced that decriminalising homosexual relations was a good idea. And so once again, this does become law, but it becomes law via a private member's bill. It's a Labour MP, Leo Absey, who introduces it. And once again, crucially, there is Roy Jenkins' support again. And in 1967, we've got the Sexual Offences Act passed, which decriminalises homosexual acts. Now, there are some quite clear conditions. Both partners clearly have to consent. Both have to be over 21. There was no equality at this point in terms of the age of consent for homosexual and heterosexual relationships. And also the acts had to be private. Now, judges quite often interpreted this in private very strictly. So it might have been a pretty big building, even a set of apartments or flats. If anybody else had been around, as far as the judges were concerned, that wasn't necessarily in private. So this still meant it was slow progress. There were still prosecutions in cases where the judges were taking an overly hard line. But nevertheless, the decriminalisation of homosexual relations in many ways is the beginning of a process which we've seen through to its inevitable conclusion with, for example, civil partnerships and same-sex marriage more recently. And once again, it's Jenkins, it's backbench MPs in the 1960s who are starting to get the process moving. One of the other really significant parts of the Wilson government that you need to be aware of is educational reform, and we're going to think briefly about both schools and universities. First of all, schools. We've talked in a previous video about the tripartite system, where students would sit the 11 plus. If they passed, they go to grammar school. If they failed, they go to secondary modern school, apart from a small few who would go to technical schools if they had a particular aptitude in a practical area. Now, the theory had been that whichever school students went to, it would have equal status, but by the 60s it was clear that wasn't the case. Grammar schools were generally better resourced, better funded, and society viewed grammar school pupils as the success stories. If you went to a secondary modern, you'd often be made to feel a failure, and the whole system seemed to reinforce class division. It was almost not impossible, but it was unlikely if you were a working class child that you would pass the 11 plus and get into a grammar school. Grammar schools were dominated by middle class pupils. Now, schools were run by LEAs, by local educational authorities linked to the local councils. And even before the Wilson government, in some places, Greater London, as it was controlled by a Labour council, they'd actually said, look, the tripartite system has had its day. We are going to set up comprehensive schools. Comprehensive schools are the kind of schools that a lot of you will have gone to. Schools that aren't selective, they're not fee paying, they're simply open to all in a particular local area. So even by the time Wilson comes to power, about 1 in 10 pupils are in comprehensives. Now, just as Jenkins is our key person for liberal reform, here Tony Crossland is our key person for education reform. He is Wilson's education minister, member of the cabinet, and a really fervent believer in the comprehensive system. He believes that education is the route to equality. He believes that education is fundamental if you are a socialist or a social democrat. So Crossland, as soon as he comes to power in 1965, says to LEAs, I request that you convert to the comprehensive system. Now, a request is different to making something into law. What Crossland is basically saying is, look, I'm strongly suggesting you to do this. I'm urging you to do it. I'm requesting you do it. He can't force LEAs to do it. Nevertheless, when Crossland says in 1966, if you want funding from the government for your new school buildings, you've got to convert to comprehensives, then clearly most LEAs are only going to go in one direction. So after 1966, there's a real move towards comprehensives. It clearly isn't going to happen overnight, but by 1970, we've gone from a tenth to a third of all secondary pupils educated in comprehensives, and as the 70s go on, that process accelerates further. Now, clearly, if you are at school at the time and your school is converting, it's going to be disruptive for teachers, for pupils, for parents. But Wilson says this is absolutely necessary. We want everybody to have a brilliant education, a grammar school education for everyone, and comprehensives ensure that all the division, all the inequality of the tripartite system won't happen anymore. Now, some middle-class parents say, well, we don't want this. We liked the grammar schools. We're going to send our children instead to fee-paying independent schools. So one of the problems for Crossland and Wilson straight away from the beginning is that in some ways this is never going to be a truly comprehensive system, because rather than going to the grammar schools, some of the middle class students simply go to the independent schools and benefit from smaller class sizes, for example, more resources, more money. And so there is a problem here. Nevertheless, in terms of impact, in terms of significance, once again, this is a really major change that the Wilson government is making. And a final issue is the issue of higher education, in other words, university education. There was real worry in the 60s, 1961, that Britain was slipping behind when it came to education in technology and in science, and a committee was set up called the Robbins Committee, which reported back and said, yes, we are slipping behind. We are not providing enough university places, particularly in science and technology, if you compare Britain to Germany, to America, to France. And Robbins also says, yes, it's true as well, that we're so focused on the humanities and the arts that we're neglecting science and technology. So Wilson responds to this and he says, absolutely true. What we will do is we'll expand higher education, we'll create more university places, and we'll try and focus in particular on science and technology. A couple of really key developments. Wilson sets up these new polytechnics. They're very much focused on teaching rather than teaching plus research, as older universities were focused on applied education, on science, and these become a central part of higher education in the Wilson years. Wilson expands the number of universities. Some existing advanced technology colleges become universities. Universities that have really recently been founded get their charters, in other words, a document officially saying you are now a full university, and completely new universities are set up as well. And the statistics speak for themselves. So by 1968, you've got 30 of these new polytechnics and you've got 56 universities. And a lot of the new universities are offering courses that weren't available before, things like architecture and town planning. And crucially, these are opening up opportunities. Quite often, if you're a child whose parents, grandparents have never been to university, never experienced higher education, all of a sudden you may get the chance to be the first person in your family to experience that. So the polytechnics in particular expand those opportunities. Having said that, if you were to look at some of the older red brick universities, Manchester, Sheffield, and particularly Oxford and Cambridge, you would see that even then they were dominated by the middle classes. So once again, yes, there's progress, but there's still quite a way to go. Nevertheless, a really significant achievement, and finally here for Wilson, is the Open University which he sets up. Wilson believes this is probably his greatest achievement of all, and we can see why. The Open University was an idea that had been originally suggested by a group of Labour activists in 1963, and it's an idea that Wilson's very keen on when he comes to power. And Jenny Lee, who's his Minister of the Arts, another member of his government, is the person who's given the job of setting the Open University up. Now, what is the Open University? It still exists today. Basically, it offers a university-level education to people who never had the opportunity to attend university, perhaps because they were women and wasn't something that many women were allowed to do, perhaps because they were from a working class background, perhaps for financial reasons, perhaps because they'd been labelled as a failure during the tripartite system. So this was about trying to expand opportunities, particularly for people who wouldn't have had that opportunity before. And interestingly, the Open University pioneers something that all of a sudden we've all become experts in, which is distance learning. Although rather than thinking about Zoom and Microsoft Teams, this was more new use of TV, of radio. And if you were to switch on the TV in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you would see loads of Open University broadcasts with university lecturers delivering their lectures via TV and radio. It was opening it up for more and more people. And as you can see, Most OU students are obviously doing it from home. They're mainly part-time. Quite a lot of them, we've talked about women and working class people, quite a lot of them are mature students as well, people who maybe didn't have a great experience of education as children, but are really keen to broaden their horizons now. And in terms of the chronology, by 1969, the OU is set up in Milton Keynes, and students begin to study via the Open University at the beginning of 1971. And we can see why Wilson views this as such a success. It really does have an impact on people's self-esteem, people who had maybe labelled themselves as failures or been labelled failures in education, suddenly able to access higher education for the first time. And also look at the take-up rate as well. By 1980, 70,000 people are Open University students, and a nice little statistic there, it's awarding more degrees than Oxford and Cambridge put together. And throughout this PowerPoint, I think we can see that although the Wilson government never really achieved a lot of its economic aims and its economic plans, in terms of the impact on society and the impact on education, we can potentially argue that the Wilson government, and particularly people like Jenkins, Crossland and Jenny Lee, have a massive impact, whether or not you think it's for good or for ill, on British society in the 1960s.
Huge thank you to Tom for that video. Really interesting stuff on the liberal reforms under the Labour Party. And this is part of our wider playlist and series on Britain from 1951 through to 2007, which is Modern History A-Level Unit 2S from AQA. And this is one of the units that we cover. There's a whole range of other stuff on the channel, and also a load of stuff on A-Level Politics. So if you found this useful and you want more of the same, then please hit like, leave us some comments and subscribe, get notifications as more gets added. Thank you very much for watching.